watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink. And today is the second episode in our series Flash in the Can, the one-hit wonders of cult cinema. Today we'll be discussing 1973's The Wicker Man. The Wicker Man is a 1973 film directed by Robin Hardy that follows Sergeant Howie, played by Edward Woodward, as he arrives on a small Scottish island to investigate the report of a missing child. A conservative Christian, the policeman observes the residents' frivolous sexual displays and strange pagan rituals, particularly the temptations of Willow, played by Britt Eklund, daughter of the island magistrate, Lord Somersill, Christopher Lee. The more Sergeant Howie learns about the islanders' strange practices, the closer he gets to tracking down the missing child.
Mm-hmm. Lots of debauchery and nudity.
Yes. And just a note, as we dig in here, this is the 1973 The Wicker Man, not to be confused with the 2006 The Wicker Man starring Nicolas Cage, nor The Wicker Tree, which was actually directed by the same director and came out in 2011. That's kind of a companion piece from what I understand. I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, me neither. But we will touch on that, when we're discussing, behind the scenes
But
stuff.
today we are focused on the 1973 The Wicker Man.
It's the non-Nicolas Cage one.
No bees. No bees in this movie.
No bees. No memes, as far as I know anyway. Yeah. So Jeremy, so this is your first time seeing this film, The Wicker Man, and I had only seen it once before, I believe, but it's very memorable, this film, and with some chilling and pretty haunting and some flat-out bizarre imagery as well. And lots of music, which I had forgotten about. This is kind of a musical.
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit.
So, there are a few musical scenes.
Yeah, so what did you think about, the movie itself and the music?
So the movie itself, I'm just going to come out and say it straight up. I absolutely love this movie. This is one of the favorites, I think, that maybe in the whole pod, at least upon first watch. Obviously, it takes a few viewings and maybe a little time to really come to conclusions. But for me, I watched this movie just this morning before we were digging into this now, and my first reaction, I was just totally thrilled. I thought I had a feeling you'd be into this one. Yeah, I think something that I'm always kind of drawn to is this idea of characters kind of taking on other character roles within a story. And I love this little microcosm of this society set up on this island and how they all kind of play their roles within the society, but also play their roles within the rituals that they're getting into. And I also kind of like in Carnival of Souls, which we recently talked about, this idea of the kind of fear and horror coming from just the existence of people and entities that we don't totally understand. Because I think what I really enjoyed about this movie and why it feels like such a unique horror movie and such an inspiration, I think now, having seen this, I can kind of see the through line to a lot of other horror films that I enjoy, is that it's not really about scaring you constantly. It's kind of about just creating this underlying fear and feeling that something scary is happening.
It's building something.
But really nothing other than maybe a few scary images, I suppose. There's a couple kind of grotesque images carried throughout, but there's nothing really for the first, hour and 20 minutes of the movie
probably,
like that's actually scary. It's mostly just someone talking to people and investigating a mystery.
Exactly. Everything is under the surface almost, which was intentional. The writer of this film, Anthony Schaefer, he set out to write a non-conventional horror film, and he didn't want any blood, any gore, no jump scares or anything like that. He just wanted to write a very unsettling, haunting film, which I think he definitely accomplished. And this film is very influential, as you mentioned. You see echoes of this film in many other horror films and many other films in general after it. And there is just something so unsettling about the film, and it's kind of hard to put into words in a way.
It's definitely a little uncanny. But it doesn't.
It's unique.
But it's what's interesting about it is it doesn't feel. I suppose there is a little bit of a super. Actually, there's not really even. I guess there's a little bit of a supernatural element.
That, it could be implied, but
yeah. Like there's one scene where the character Willow kind of seduces a guy through a wall.
Through the wall.
Which I guess, but that's kind of the most supernatural thing, which it really isn't.
It's almost like witchcraft, but not really.
But it isn't even totally supernatural because it's one of those things where, someone could seduce someone by talking to them. It's not totally outside of just
she's singing, I guess. But,
but she's singing. But it's not like the way it's portrayed makes it feel like it's a little supernatural, but it's not really an unbelievable thing,
It's more avant-garde than that, I feel like.
And that's a great way of putting it. And I think that this movie either is kind of starting the tradition of, or is in the vein of these kind of 70s avant-garde horror films. I know we haven't talked about it on this podcast, but it's kind of been brought up at times. I believe is Don't Look Now.
Yes,
that movie came to mind.
I'm going to bring up later as well. Yeah,
yeah. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, kind of this daylight horror. And then a movie I actually haven't seen it, but I know it's been compared to this. I don't know if you've seen it, but Ari Aster's Midsommar, which recently.
No,
I guess it's not recently at this point. It kind of came out about a year ago, but I know that movie deals with kind of pagan ritual and is apparently all set in the daytime. So you do see kind of strains of this movie running through a lot of American movies that went on to be really successful horror films.
Definitely. And we've talked a lot about tone recently, Jeremy, with these films. And how would you describe the tone of this film? Because I got echoes of like Hitchcock, Hitchcock in there.
Yeah.
A lot of like paranoia, kind of subjective filmmaking in there. But I don't know, what was your takeaway from that?
Yeah, I think Hitchcock is a good point of reference.
I don't know if it was intentional or not, just kind of a vibe that I got.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things
I've also been watching a lot of Hitchcock lately. So.
Yeah, well, I also think, a filmmaker in 1974 making a psychological kind of thriller film inevitably will be drawing something from Hitchcock. At that, it's kind of like how every filmmaker now, in one way or another, whether they're rejecting or accepting him, is probably influenced by Quentin Tarantino. It's like I feel like a Hitchcock in that time would have just been totally unavoidable for these filmmakers.
Yeah.
And
also, it's kind of that Twilight Zone aspect as well.
Yeah.
It's like someone's in this very strange situation. They're kind of the everyman character, and they're kind of just plopped into a certain scenario, and that's what this film is basically for most of it. And although the character is very interesting, and I want to talk a little bit we've touched on the plot a little bit, but I want to talk about the acting in it because, first of all, it takes place in Scottish territory. It's supposed to be a Scottish island, I believe. Although most of the cast is made up of Brits, so a lot of British actors in this movie. Of course, you mentioned, the one who comes to mind first, Christopher Lee, even though he's not the main character and actually doesn't show up until probably like an hour into the film. But he's there, and the main character, he's played by Edward Woodward. He's playing Sergeant Howie, and I thought he did a great job because he's playing this, as you mentioned, a very religious, straight-laced police officer. And his character he's kind of like the core of the film, I feel like, because a lot is relying on him. We are following him throughout the entire film, and we're seeing everything almost from his perspective in a way, which makes it somewhat more unsettling and more creepy, I think.
Yeah, because he doesn't know.
Because he has no idea. Yeah,
it's kind of like the classic Humphrey Bogart, detective on a mystery, and we're with him. I think he's probably in pretty much every scene of the movie, right? I could be wrong about that, but for the most part, there might be a few where he doesn't pop up. But for the most part, he's in pretty much every single scene of this movie, and we're definitely seeing it through his perspective. And I think what that does is it makes it so this idea of not knowing becomes so much more frightening because as the audience, we're only getting the information he's getting. We're not getting anything else.
Right. Very subjective, right. And he was a trooper too, by the way.
Yeah.
I was, reading a lot about this movie, and I watched a making of and things like that, and so he's really in that Wicker Man structure at the end.
Oh yeah.
I'm not sure if everyone knows that, but he's actually not when they completely burn it down, obviously,
But
but
for a little bit, he was up
for
there.
a little bit, yeah. When there's some fire going and he's in there, and
Mm-hmm.
there is a goat above him that urinates on him, apparently.
Oh, really? Jeez.
Yes. So he was definitely down for it, and I think I saw an interview with him where he was kind of like, yeah, the things you do when you're in your 20s or whatever, when you're
Yeah.
younger. So yeah, and that was also just a part of that 70s filmmaking, Jeremy, which you touched on a little bit there.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the kind of go for broke attitude, the kind of rawness that you saw in a lot of these films.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that you don't necessarily see nowadays, but at that time, it's like everyone was kind of on that page. Everyone was kind of going for it in a way.
Yeah, it does seem like there was a certain kind of fearlessness, particularly in 70s independent film.
Yeah.
Where like it like you said, this kind of go for broke attitude where you'd see these people just getting totally invested and wrapped up in these films and kind of pushing the boundaries of
Mm-hmm.
where the film ended and where where the film story ended and where like the filmmaking story ended. They kind of would like blur into each other a little bit,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
which obviously is a risky thing to do. It's kind of a scary thing to do, especially if we're talking about this situation. If
Yeah.
he's up in this Wicker Man structure, he's probably in a little bit of real danger. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Because it's not a stuntman either. I mean, they
Yeah,
had to see his face. So
yeah, it's not a stunt,
it had to be
which
him.
gives it a certain, like I think that's what makes that scene kind of so frightening.
Mm-hmm.
Is he's really up there, and there's a
Mm-hmm.
thing where you're
You can
seeing,
feel it. You
yeah,
can feel the heat when he's in that
yeah, it
structure.
doesn't feel like a controlled stunt. It feels like
Mm-hmm.
you're actually just watching this happen. Almost,
Exactly.
and,
You nailed it right there. Yeah.
yeah, and the look of this film to me, it's interesting. I actually last night ended up at the Museum of Modern Art, which just reopened.
Oh,
So any of our New York City listeners,
nice.
or not New York City listeners, definitely get there and check it out. They have a fantastic film department.
Mm-hmm.
But I saw this film called I Need a Ride to California, which is a Morris Engel film. He's the guy who directed a film called Little Fugitive, is what he's most known for. And it was actually the world premiere of the film, but the film came out in 1968 and had just been shelved. And it was a
Mm-hmm.
fictional film that had this real documentary feel that almost felt like kind of a D.A. Pennebaker kind of like music film, like a concert film or something like that, in the look and the feeling of it. And there's something about the Wicker Man that almost like the camera work isn't really documentary style or anything like that, but it kind of the whole thing has this feeling of like watching something real unfolding. It's kind of hard to
Mm-hmm.
place exactly what it is. I don't know if it's just the look of the film that
Yeah.
it has this kind of 70s, a little bit faded look to it that almost makes it feel like a lost artifact.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it is something that has to do with the fact that it is, as this is our one hit wonder series. Robin Hardy never really created another hit film. He really didn't direct too many films at all. I think
No,
he
only a
only
couple.
did 2 or 3 films. One of
Yeah.
those being The Wicker Tree, which came out in 2011 and
2000.
did
Yeah.
not really take off at all.
No.
So I think that maybe part of it is that it wasn't. There were so many of these big auteurs in the 70s who made all these. Yeah, so he only directed 3 films. He did The Wicker Man,
Mm-hmm.
The Fantasist,
Mm-hmm.
and The Wicker Tree. And I
And
think
then I think he wrote one other one. Yeah.
yeah, and he wrote. I have it.
He wrote a
pulled up.
couple novels actually. He wrote
The Bull Dance.
the,
He wrote the story for.
he wrote the novelization of this film, I believe, and he also wrote
Mhm.
a novel which was the basis for The Wicker Tree when he eventually made that, which
Yeah.
I found interesting. Yeah.
Um,
So he was, I guess, productive, but we didn't really
he was
see much from
productive,
him.
but
Yeah.
he wasn't a Scorsese. He wasn't a Spielberg. He wasn't a De
Which is
Palma.
why we're talking
Talking
about
about him
pretty
here,
much.
but I think
Yeah.
the fact that there isn't as much scholarship on this film, it kind of doesn't get looked at as critically as a lot of those other big 70s films do.
Yeah.
Kind of gives it that artifact feel.
Why do you think that is? Do you think it's because it's so, I don't know, British, or
I don't know,
not
'cause
sure what it is about it that just doesn't
I don't
get
know, because it's
the
definitely
love.
renowned. Like people talk.
Yeah.
I mean, this film gets referred to as the I believe was it the Citizen Kane of horror films.
Right.
So it's
very well
definitely
regarded. Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely highly regarded. But it's one of those things where I don't know. It doesn't seem. I mean, to get because I love 70s film, and the fact that like I hadn't seen this until now,
Mhm.
I think is probably a testament to the fact that it somehow flies under the radar a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, also maybe it's a subject matter. I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
tackles some pretty heady things, some pretty like almost abstract concepts. So
Yeah.
obviously the main plot, it starts off about a missing girl,
Mm-hmm.
which is why Sergeant Howie goes to this island in the first place, is to find this girl.
Mm-hmm.
And right off the bat, there's something kind of odd, something kind of strange about the people that make up the inhabitants of the island, but nothing. It's kind of like they have a joyful song in the pub, and they're all singing along, and so they're strange. But he's kind of like, okay, well, I'm just gonna kind of do my own thing.
Yeah, they're just people who live on an island and they eat a lot of fruit.
Exactly. Yeah, they're they're locals.
Yeah.
So, but as he starts to look into things more, that's when the horror starts. I think when the horror begins is because it's that creeping feeling of like something is not right here, something's going on. What is it? And that's what the movie becomes about. And it also becomes, like I said, about this main character, Sergeant Howie, and also the clashing of religions is a big thing. I mean, worshiping the old gods, pagan rituals. Obviously it's a big part of the film, but also it's about different ideologies and different moral codes and how these things. How they conflict and how they come together, and I guess having two opposing points of view that are very strong, and so because the main character sees the inhabitants of this island as essentially savages.
Yeah.
Like I think he calls them barbarians at one point or something like that, like heathens. So he looks down on them. For most of the film, well, yeah. Once he realizes what's going on, he definitely looks down on them. But that brings up a topic I wanted to ask you about, Jeremy. It's a big question. Do you think there's a message to this film, either regarding morality or religion, or is it simply the backdrop of a suspenseful horror film? And I ask this because not only was it something I was thinking about when I was watching it this time, but I've seen this question posed before. I think it was on Twitter, actually. And I don't remember who the person was, to be honest. But they said something along the lines of, are we as the audience meant to truly empathize with this main character? She found the person very boring, like stick in the mud or like a wet blanket, something like that.
Yeah.
Which is funny, but I think it also brings up a good point and possibly debate about how one views this film.
Yeah.
Are we supposed to be rooting for him? Are we supposed to, it's kind of a hard question, and in some ways it's cut and dry, in some ways it's like, of course we are, but also it's like, he's so strict about his morals and everything has to be his way, and and I guess it also comes down to how you view certain organized religions and things like that. But so it's kind of a big question, but I just wanted to get your take on what you think about that.
Yeah, personally I feel that there's a couple things that play into that. And time kind of changes that, because I think coming out in the early 1970s, these days we see all kinds of things on film that would back in the day be considered kind of blasphemous to someone who is religious. And the world in that era was, at least the Christian world, I think was a lot more driven by kind of old world religious principles. Which is why I think we saw a lot of these kind of horror movies. An example would be like a Rosemary's Baby, where the horror is this idea of devil worship or paganism or something kind of other. But I think what makes this one, so I think in one sense, making him this Christian character was a way for the filmmakers to bring in those people. I think that was a way to make him relatable in the era. But what I think is so interesting about it is he, not only to me was he kind of because I don't want to use the word dull character, but compared to the other characters on the island, he's not as much fun to spend time with. Like, what makes this movie fun,
he doesn't sing at all.
He doesn't sing. He doesn't, do any weird dances. He's pretty straightforward.
No
dude.
Masks or anything. Well, actually, he does put on a mask.
He does put on a mask, but only he doesn't put on a mask because it's fun and part of his ritual.
Yeah.
but what I think makes it kind of interesting is that he's so rigid in his religious beliefs that I would say he's as rigid as they are.
Right.
Which I think is what I really like about this film, and at least my personal interpretation. I don't know too much about the director or the writer's religious beliefs, so I don't want to comment on them.
Yeah, I wasn't able to find really anything about that.
Yeah, so I don't want to comment on them, but like what I would kind of pull from it is this idea, and this particularly when they're at the end and he's screaming at them about, what if it doesn't work?
There is a certain logic to what he's saying when he's screaming at them at the end, when he's in this structure and it's being burnt. He's screaming to them, "This will not bring back your crops. This will not solve your issues." So and there's, in that sense, it's like, yeah.
But I don't think it's just a takedown of paganism. I think it's a takedown of, I don't want to say just organized religion, but of kind of like organized groups and rigid rules in general, because he's screaming at them
that's
saying
disparity, because Yeah, I see. That's why it's hard, because there is.
Yeah.
I totally get what you're saying, but
Well,
the
and the thing
fact that
that
our main character is a Christian, very Christian man. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to pin down, and it's hard to say if they did have a message or if it's just
yeah.
the way the story went. I mean, and maybe you're supposed to make up your own mind about that.
Well, and
I'm
I
really not
think
sure.
what makes it interesting, and why, at least in my reading of it, I would say that it is kind of a takedown of all of it, is that he's being so rigid and he's screaming at them about being rigid, saying it's not going to do anything. But meanwhile, the thing that's even
Right.
put him in this position is his own religious rigidity. If he
Yeah.
had just gone and slept with the woman, it wouldn't have been a
Right.
problem. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
If
Yeah.
he hadn't
It's kind of
been,
like eye for an eye in a way. That's
yeah,
part
if
of
he
what I was
hadn't been
thinking.
so passionate about his, kind of religious savior complex. You know what I mean? Because I think at a certain point, it's not just about saving this girl. You know what I mean? I think
No,
for him,
definitely.
it's kind of about like, oh, these people are savages. I need to show them the good Christian way. And so
Yeah.
if he hadn't been so rigid in his thing, he wouldn't have ended up having the tragic fate he did, which I think kind of plays at the fact that, like, as a viewer, I don't know if we're really supposed to relate to either, like, him or this group of people.
Right.
I think it's kind
Right.
of supposed to point out that either way, it's ridiculous. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? Like in any situation, letting
Yeah.
any one system of morals dictate every decision you make above
Right.
your own observations and your own
Mm-hmm.
feelings towards humanity.
Right.
That is what's supposed to be ridiculous, not
Yeah.
paganism, not
It's almost
Christianity,
like
but the
we're
whole thing.
right. It's almost like we're the objective viewer, just watching both these
Mm-hmm.
ideologies clash, in a way. And yeah, I mean, the meaning behind this film, I think it's a debate that's going to be ongoing,
Mm-hmm.
especially with time, like you said, like looking back on it, you see different things. But
Yeah.
to me, I've always viewed The Wicker Man as all about the fear that comes from being isolated. The fear of what you don't understand,
Mm-hmm.
and like you said, Jeremy, the fear of the other.
Yeah.
And that's what when I think of this film, that's mostly what I do think of, in terms of tone and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
or in terms of what they were trying to get across.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too because there is this kind of thing where obviously in the end we find out he was right, basically,
Mhm.
and they were doing some sinister things.
Yeah,
But
but
there
it's
isn't.
about
There
Sorry.
isn't really anything that gives him hard proof that anything sinister is going on until
Right.
the very end. And
Until that very yeah.
you know what I mean? And so there is that kind of thing with like the other, particularly in the world we're living in now, where there's kind of so much polarization of ideas. And, when we talk about like immigration, this fear of immigrants coming into the United States and causing crimes or anything like that. And anything where there's kind of one group who either doesn't understand another or has fear of another will kind of start to project onto
Yeah.
them and start
Like
to.
he thinks
Yeah, he
the main
starts to
character
make
like
them
thinks
evil.
he's doing the right thing, and
Yeah.
it's like part of this film is like also about how trying to do what you think is right,
Mhm.
like the right thing, how that can ultimately lead to an unfortunate ending, which
Yeah.
he clearly has. So yeah, there's a lot to kind of unpack there. That's why I think it's such an interesting and lasting film as well,
Yeah.
because there is so much there. But then you also have like things in it that I definitely want to touch on this, because we talk about a lot of cult films here, and it's the things we've said so far. It's wouldn't lead you to think this is really a cult film, but I think there's certain aspects of it.
Oh, yeah.
For one, well, I mentioned Christopher Lee is in it, who apparently agreed to do this for free. I saw him say in an interview say that, which is believable because this was a fairly low budget film, and apparently he really believed in it. He also considers it to be one of his greatest roles and like maybe one of his favorite films that he's ever been in.
Which I would agree. I mean, I haven't seen too much Christopher Lee stuff, but
Yeah.
from what I've seen, I think I think he was terrific in this movie.
Yeah, I was gonna, at first I was gonna call it a hammy role, like, he's known for doing really hamming it up in his roles. But I really think this is actually pretty tastefully done and not as over the top as it could have been for sure. So there's that aspect of it. Also, the music, I feel like, kind of brings it into that more cult territory as well, because there's a lot of it is, I guess, traditional folk songs that have been reinterpreted, and also a couple original songs, I believe, as well, and kind of brings it to a different surreal level. You mentioned that scene where the woman, I forget her name, but she's in the
Willow?
hotel. Yeah, Willow.
Yeah.
Because I think it's called Willow Song, actually. When he checks into the inn and he's in the bedroom, I think he's like praying or something like that, saying his prayers, and she is calling out to him through song. through the wall basically, and she's singing this song to him, and she's completely nude. It's definitely one of the stranger musical
Yeah.
scenes I think I've ever seen in a movie.
And the song is terrific, though. That is a
Yeah,
great
it's a
song.
great, yeah, and the music is, I think, all around is pretty well done in this film.
Hmm.
And yeah, the musical moments were something that when I rewatched it this time, I had completely forgotten about them for the most part. I remembered
Yeah.
that one part, but yeah, I forgot just how much music there is in the film. And I think the director actually joked to the crew like halfway through, like, "Oh, by the way, we're making a musical."
Yeah.
It's like
Which they
he thought
kind
we
of
were making a
were.
horror film.
Yeah.
Yeah, they kind of were. Yeah, and it's it's a horror movie, but it's also, it has these like playful and silly moments to it.
Hmm.
But I guess that scene in particular where she's nude singing through the wall, I guess it's meant to show the temptation that
Hmm.
Sergeant Howie is continually fighting against in this movie.
Well, it's kind of like the classic idea of the siren. You know,
Mhm.
the historically we'd see the siren character.
Yeah,
It's a bit of a trope, and I guess that's kind
yeah,
of what she's supposed to
right. And it
represent.
also goes with the theme of fertility and rebirth,
Hmm.
cleansing of sin, and all that. Yeah. But what did you think about the music? How it was used in the film? Did you think it worked pretty well?
Yeah, I thought it worked really well, actually. Because I think it's one of those things where just watching it through, as I was watching it, the music, it didn't really seem even like a musical to me. It just kind of seemed like there are these people who are an agricultural people, and they kind of use song to pass the time. But now, like, thinking about it and talking to you about it, I realized how it wasn't just that. It really played in more. The music really kind of carried certain moments. And it was more than just kind of like a whistle while you work
Yeah,
thematic thing.
it wasn't like, okay, now we're gonna do a song. It was like,
Yeah.
this is all part of the world that he's in now. This
Yeah.
island that he's living on.
Which I think adds
Um,
to kind of that eerie feeling of it. You know,
yeah.
it's kind of the normal world, yet they sing, you know,
Hmm.
and they play music. And there's also this really interesting thing that would happen too, which I really loved, where it seemed like, and there were a couple moments of this, once in the scene with the seduction, but I think earlier on there was, and there might even be more than just the ones I've kind of noticed and pointed out here, where someone will be playing music or singing music on one part of the island, and someone else on the other side of the island or in another location will kind of be singing or tapping along or
Hmm.
kind of interacting with the music as if they were right there
Hmm.
listening to it, but they're nowhere near it,
Right.
which
I
kind of
didn't even
adds
notice
to
that.
this like
Yeah.
supernatural feeling,
Okay.
but in a
Yeah,
really
definitely.
subtle way where like we as an audience might not even really question it, but it's
Hmm.
very bizarre. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's.
Like if you
Yeah.
saw a movie
Yeah.
and there was a band playing a concert and someone in another location in another scene happened to
Yeah.
be playing the same music at the same time, you'd be like, "Oh, that's a weird, stupid
Yeah.
coincidence." But like in
It's.
this, it's seamless. It's totally seamless.
Hmm. And it's showing in a very subtle way that these people are different than him, and they're all on their own wavelength. And he's the outsider.
Hmm.
And there's different techniques used throughout the film that I think build, and the surreal quality of it starts to build and become more and more. And I think once we see those animal masks, I feel like the
Hmm.
film kind of is officially getting to that next realm. And I
Yeah.
always found, those animal masks that they start to wear, I always found them very creepy and unsettling. And one of the first things I would think about when I thought of this movie, because that always creeped me out
Hmm.
when I first saw it, there's something oddly menacing about these just very blank-faced animal masks that they wear,
Hmm.
which I know is part of the ritual as well, but it adds so much to that horror aspect, I think.
Yeah.
And I think you see that in a lot of films now today. I mean, obviously there's like the 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 huge examples of like Jason from Friday the 13th and
Yeah.
all that, but I think even now, like, I think I haven't seen it, but The Strangers, I believe,
Yeah.
they use masks and that, like, just kind of like those
The
blank
Purge.
face masks.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like you see a lot of that now, even in Dark Knight, like the Joker used a mask and things like that. So you
Yeah.
see that pop up a lot, and that might be like a something that's just like lurking underneath, like humanity just like has this fear of masks or something
Yeah.
that I'm not sure, but
I think it's like a fear of the uncanny. Like when you don't know
and,
what's
and of the
behind it, you
unknown.
don't know if you can trust
You
it or
don't know
not.
what's there exactly, and I think that's a huge part of this film as
Yeah,
well.
it's interesting, and it's even like I mean, as we're talking about the influence, I recently just watched the movie Child's Play somehow for the first time. I had
Okay, yeah.
managed to avoid it for years and years, and I found that the Chucky doll was way more scary
Hmm.
when he was just a cute little Chucky doll. Like as soon as he became like the evil Chucky, he kind
Yeah.
of like took some of the mystery out, and it became more of a thriller. But when he was just like this
Uh-huh.
cute little doll, it was horrifying.
Yeah,
The movie
that's funny.
these masks actually called to mind for me more than anything else, and the way they were shot and everything was Eyes Wide Shut.
Yeah,
Which
that
is
too.
interesting because I feel like like Kubrick, it very rarely gets talked about who influenced him. You
Hmm.
know what I mean? Like it's even though you can find little flashes of other people's work in Kubrick's movies, it generally,
Hmm.
I don't know if it's just a cultural thing and that's how we've built it up, but it seems like he's just this mad genius who comes up with every idea on his own and just executes it and it's perfect. But
Hmm.
the way the masks were shot with kind of these long, static, glaring shots of these characters where you're not even sure if they're looking at the camera or at the character,
Hmm.
kind of very still, maybe a little Dutch and crooked, shooting from kind of a low angle, I think really is almost exactly how Kubrick shot some of those big cult scenes in Eyes Wide
Hmm.
Shut,
Yeah,
which I think, I'm pretty damn sure he would have seen this movie. Um,
probably.
it,
Yeah.
it seems like in that era, he was pretty into avant-garde film. Actually,
Hmm.
very into avant-garde film. I know he was a huge fan of like Eraserhead and a bunch of other kind of out there movies, and which
Hmm.
makes sense because his movies were pretty out there, despite the fact that they were big Hollywood events.
Right.
And I don't know, like tonally, I really think that this movie is kind of in a weird way almost a companion piece to An Eyes Wide Shut. You have
Yeah.
this outsider coming in to a civilization of people who he doesn't necessarily understand, kind of
Hmm.
wanting to be part of it, but also kind of wanting to break it down.
Yeah.
And ultimately, like almost nothing happens,
Hmm.
but it's still frightening because there's this underlying fear that he's getting into something that's above his head.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I mean, I know that Eyes Wide Shut was adapted, I believe, from a story. I think it's called like Trumnavale or something like that.
Hmm.
But I don't know the cinematic language is constructed between the two movies. I think has some real parallels, which is kind of
Hmm.
interesting because, like I said, Kubrick, he's kind of known as the grand genius who is always
Yeah.
innovating and always doing it first. But I think he definitely, I don't really want to say
Yeah.
definitely because I don't have any documentation proving it,
Hmm.
but I would venture to say that he pulled a little bit from this movie.
Yeah, I mean, The Wicker Man was incredibly influential, which we've touched on before, and I think it's certainly true. And I think the more you like, once you see this film, and then you start to think about other films,
Hmm.
you definitely see it. Like even Hot Fuzz apparently was
Yeah,
influenced by this film,
yeah, I can
which is
totally
a
see it.
comedy, but
Yeah,
yeah, you can definitely see elements of it there.
yeah.
But it's all over the British comedy troupe, League of Gentlemen. I don't know if you know about them, but they're they're interesting because they're a comedy troupe that's very influenced by horror films,
Interesting.
particularly 70s, 80s British horror films.
Hmm.
And one of their recurring skits is very influenced by The Wicker Man when he first goes into that pub and is confronted by all these strange people. The townsfolk.
Hmm.
They have a recurring sketch that's sort of like that. So it's this movie is just very, even though it was very under the radar when it came out, which I'll talk about in a second. It did go on to be, very much a cult film, and part of that is due to the imagery and also the ending. I definitely want to talk about that ending, that
Hmm.
last scene. So, story-wise, eventually by the end of the film, and this is essentially the very end of the film. It's a pretty short film. It's a slim hour and a half.
Hmm.
So Lord Summer Isle, who is played by Christopher Lee, who's like the ruler of this island, I guess. He tells Sergeant Howie that the missing girl, Rowan, was never the intended sacrifice, and that Howie himself is.
Hmm.
And he fits all the requirements that the old gods have. He came of his own free will. He has the power of a king, I guess because he's a police officer representing the law.
Hmm.
He is a virgin, and he is apparently a fool.
Hmm.
So those four things,
Well, I think he wears the fool costume,
he does
so
wear the
he's
fool
the
costume.
fool.
That's
He's
correct.
literally the
Yes,
fool.
right, and they view him as a fool as well.
Hmm.
And so that all culminates, and the whole film, really, every scene culminates in that final scene, that ending. And I feel like I said before, like I feel like the film is building to that scene, that final image, and in fact, you don't see the actual Wicker Man structure itself until that last scene, until like there's only a few shots left.
Hmm.
And that scene to me is one of the greatest set pieces in all of horror films, and I
Hmm.
would say even in cult film. The fact, like we said, that the actor is actually in there, it does add to it as it starts to be set ablaze, and there's animals in there, which apparently were not hurt. I did look into that.
Yes.
That's what they're claiming anyway.
Hopefully.
And yeah, it seems to check out. But anyway, so yeah, there's a rawness to that scene. There's that imagery is undeniable. Just that wicker structure going up in flames with the man inside, while these inhabitants of the island are chanting around him and singing. It's so bizarre, and also what the film is like I said, what it leads up to. And as we discussed, it's part of that kind of go for broke nature of the 70s. But also it really is just that scene. It truly is a nightmare. And this film feels like a nightmare. And by the end of it, when that structure goes down, when it is demolished by the fire and you see the setting sun, I mean, you just feel like you just woke up from a dream or something. It has that feel to it. But how do you view that last scene? Did you feel affected by it, or?
Yeah, I thought it was just totally overwhelming. It's one of those.
Did you know
things...
that was coming? Because I know you hadn't seen it, but did you know that was like it was all leading?
I didn't know exactly what it would be. I had seen the image of this giant burning man.
You figured there was a Wicker Man at some point, probably.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, I mean, if you type in the Wicker Man 1973 on the internet, the first image that comes up is the Wicker Man. You know what I mean? So it's not the kind of thing you can really avoid. Yeah. But, I didn't know what context it would be in. And I kind of, honestly, as I was going through the movie, forgot about it. I really knew, going into this, I did not know what this movie was about. At all. I had no idea. I really, I went out of my way to avoid knowing what it was about. So, in the first 15 or 20 minutes of the film, that image was kind of in my mind. I thought, oh, maybe we'll see this, halfway through, and it'll be some kind of, some kind of ritual, but maybe they're, praying to this sculpture. You know what I mean? I didn't think that would end up being the death device.
Right.
And the
film the film just ends there too.
It's not ends,
there's no bumper at the end, or that's just it.
And which I love. I love when movies,
I think
they get in and they get out.
It.
Yeah,
exactly. And this movie is pretty short and sweet. But part of that is due to the fact that it was heavily cut, which I want to talk about a little bit, because I think it's important to this film actually becoming a cult film in some ways. So the producers of this film, British Lion Films, they were not believers in this film. when I saw the final cut of it, they wanted to put a happy ending on there, as studios usually do, and which I think, and rightfully, the crew and the director and writer of this film were very adamant that they would not change the ending of the film, because that completely ruins the movie. So they did not change it, and so they did release the film, but the studio released it sort of under the radar. They released it as a double bill with a movie that you actually mentioned earlier, Jeremy, Don't Look Now.
Oh yeah, I didn't even realize that. That's awesome.
Yeah, which is another, I think, a really good British.
Yeah, 70s that would be a really overwhelming double bill to sit and watch in one night. That would be a really intense experience.
Yeah, two wildly different British horror films that I think are both really great cult films as well. So I mean, thinking about it now, it's like that's awesome. But at the time, the makers of this film were obviously, I'm sure, bummed out by the fact that they were getting just released as a double bill. So it was kind of went under the radar. It was released, and that was it. And then years later, as mostly happens with these cult films, people began to rediscover it, and I think that the fact that it was released that way actually helped it, because then it became more of like a, people had to seek it out, and it became this dangerous film that people wanted to find, and they had heard of something about it, so that kind of added to the mystique of it, and I think it actually ended up helping it in a lot of ways.
Which is the case for a lot of films we've talked about.
Exactly,
in the series.
Right, definitely. And once it was discovered, obviously it was very influential and all of that. And that the ending has a big thing to do with it, I think. And so I'm really glad they didn't change that, obviously. I think cinema would be quite different if they had. And we do want to mention Robin Hardy, as we mentioned, did not direct much besides this film. He did direct The Wicker Tree in 2011, which is a sort of a spiritual successor to this film, a companion piece, I believe. And he actually did intend to make a third film, which would close out his quasi-trilogy, but he unfortunately passed away before he could do that. So I have not seen The Wicker Tree, and you said you haven't seen it as well, so I'm not sure where that stands. I haven't seen much about it. Like, I don't know if it has any cred or anything like that. I mean, maybe that's one of those movies that'll be discovered later as well.
Yeah, I know that it wasn't particularly well reviewed when it came out. But that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested to check it out just because it was the same director and he had written the story for it and everything like that. So I was curious, and I may still watch it at some point. And of course, there was the remake, which came out in 2006.
Correct.
It starred Nicolas Cage. And so, where is this film? I have not seen that movie, but obviously, you can't go on YouTube and type in The Wicker Man without a ridiculous scene of Nicolas Cage popping up from this movie where, how'd they get burned or whatever. So
the bees, not the bees.
Yeah, not the bees. Because apparently, in this film, the main character is a virgin and very straight-laced Christian. And in the remake, I believe he's scared of bees. I think that's... they replaced it with... That's what I heard anyway. I'm not sure.
Well, the remake, I believe, was PG-13.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah, it was in that mid-2000s stretch of a lot of PG-13 horror movies coming out where they were kind of being consumed. I think they changed apples to honey as well. Like the crops that were apples in this film were changed to honey, I think. Yeah. That had something to do with it. I don't know.
But anyway, so exactly. The scenes I did see, Nicolas Cage punches a lot of people in the face, though. That was one thing I noticed. So hey, it seems like a different kind of cult film. Which I would probably actually enjoy and on a certain level, not anywhere near what this film is, but maybe as a campy.
That might have fit into our So Bad It's Good series.
Exactly. Yeah. I think we are gonna have to do probably at least a second part to that one.
Although
we have lots of
although there is something to be said about a film and its remake both being cult films.
And that's
kind of interesting.
And so vastly different.
Different, for very different reasons.
Because that movie is pretty notorious, actually, as being just like a really, they were not on the right path with that film. No. And they made it anyway, so it's one of those. So yeah, I might check it out at some point. But this film, the 1973 British horror film, The Wicker Man, I think one of the all-time classic horror films of all time, and I think it really holds up. And I guess, was there anything else you wanted to say about this film, Jeremy?
No. I mean, like I said, I've only watched this once. I watched it today, but upon first viewing, I was totally immersed in all about this movie. I thought it was an awesome horror movie experience.
Well, wait a few years and watch it again, because it'll still be good. Yeah. So, that's going to do it for this episode of Cult Movie Cult. Thanks for listening. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, or if you'd like to join the cult and be a guest on the show, please reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.